Hello, 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 hello. Are you ready to start? Can someone go to YouTube to see if it's working? Are we live? Not yet. Thanks. I'm waiting for the okay from over there. Oh. Hello everyone, good morning. We have the great honor today to receive Daniel Katz. He's Chief Scientist of the Network Center for Supercomputing Applications and Associated Professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And he's a very good guy to promote open science and mainly using software. He's, for instance, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Open Software. And he advocates the open science in a different ways. And so, Daniel, please.
Okay, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak. So I'm going to talk about research software and in the context of open science, and I'm going to do this by using a few different applications that are being worked on at NCSA in part to try to illustrate some pieces of this example of the ideas. So first, I'll just say that my PhD is in electrical engineering. I was working in computational electromagnetics, basically simulating Maxwell's equations. And I've worked in industry at Cray Research and a national laboratory, at Jet Propulsion Lab, in academia, and in government at the National Science Foundation. And I've now been at the University of Illinois for the last 8 years. And my interests have become more general over time. So I started off working in just this one area of Maxwell's equations, and then became more interested in computational science more generally, and then data science, and then how science and people work together, and then later how metrics and incentives actually help people and science work, and what makes things happen. And the most dramatic change that I had was when I was working at the National Science Foundation, where I had a program where we could give out money to support research software that was intended to help people do research. And we had a limited amount of money. And it became clear to me that no matter how much money I had, there were always going to be more good projects than we could fund. And so that led me to start thinking about, rather than just funding these projects directly, what can I do indirectly to make people work on these projects? Because it's just part of their job. It's part of what they want to do. How can we get better software without actually paying people for all of the software? What else can we do? So the University of Illinois, where I am, has a mission that includes learning, of course, as a university, but it also includes discovery and economic development. And the university has a research statement as well that includes fostering discovery and innovation as part of our fundamental mission. We're a public university funded by the state of Illinois, and as such, we have a responsibility to the state to improve the state. At the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where I primarily work, we are trying to bring together people, computing, and data to benefit society. And we are working towards a future that's enlightened by research discoveries, right, where the boundaries of human understanding are continually extended to improve the world. So this is kind of context of where I am and why I'm doing some of these things. We are one of 10 campus interdisciplinary research institutes, meaning we're not part of a department or a school. We work for the campus as a whole. We started in 1986. We have about $50 million US annually that we get in terms of research funding from a variety of public and private and industry sources. The idea that we have is that computing and data are essential to almost all areas of scholarship today. And this goes from software to applications development to designing and operating supercomputers. And we have about 250 staff and postdocs and about 200 faculty from around the university that are affiliated with the center. Okay, so I want to start off with one example. I kind of thought a little bit about using this example of permafrost in Brazil, but I thought, well, it's okay. Maybe it's something new. Maybe it's going to be a warm day. People want to hear about some place that's colder. So permafrost is, let's see, does this work? Sorry, the visual is not great here. There's a little bit of light, and I'm not I don't think I can see the cursor. So I'll just say that the areas that are in blue and dark blue are areas where there is permafrost continuously, and as the colors get lighter, there's permafrost some of the time. Permafrost is basically that there's kind of frozen water that's part of the soil, and it turns the soil into a much harder object than it would be otherwise. And the permafrost basically is melting because the climate is changing. And so the places with stars are places where there have been particular observations of this, but it's really happening everywhere. And what happens is in the picture on the right, you can see areas that look like polygons, look like shapes with little bits of water in between. And this is what happens when the permafrost melts, is it turns into these polygons, and they often get water that melts and gets trapped in the middle. And so the land surface changes, and this has a lot of consequences. One consequence is that you can have hills that were held in place by permafrost, and when the permafrost melts, the hillside slides down. And so that leads to pretty dramatic effects, particularly if there are people nearby. You can have lakes where the edges of the lakes were held together by permafrost, and so if the permafrost melts, the edge may have a place that becomes softer and a channel forms and the lake drains. You can have infrastructure damage because there's a house or a building that's built on the ground, and as the ground melts, the building then settles. And you can have areas that were forest or shrubbery that then turn into lakes over time. And we have a lot of data for this. This is showing satellite data that's been collected over roughly a 20-year period. And all the satellite data is great, but we don't actually necessarily know how to use all of it. And when we do use it, we use data that's old. We don't use current data often. And when we create products or information from this data, it's very hard to get them to the people that need them in order to do their own research, in order to do engineering, in order to understand how people are going to live with this change. So 8 collaborating institutions got together about 3 years ago with the idea of trying to change the situation. And they decided that they were going to try to build this permafrost discovery gateway. And the vision was then to connect people and geospatial data to work towards near real-time automated monitoring of the Arctic landscape that's available to anybody through the internet. And the strategy then is to create a web platform that simplifies knowledge generation from this data. And this is called the Permafrost Discovery Gateway. You can go to this URL and you can see what there is today. This vision is, I think, quite easy to understand. And this concept of a web platform is simple, and everybody's used to using the web, and so this is appealing for a lot of people, I think. However, there's a lot of complexity in the details of how to actually do this. And particularly in an academic setting, there's a bunch of different challenges. So let me talk about a little bit of what's happened. Initially, the University of Connecticut had a model called MAPLE that was used to look at satellite images and use machine learning to find these ice wedge polygons. And what this project did was to take this model and to demonstrate how it could work with a set of tools, something we run at NCSA called Clouder, that's a data management tool. And so we put these two things together. We would have liked to have used industry AI workflows, but they're very interactive, using this concept of ML ops, machine learning operations. But science workflows are not generally so interactive. They're generally batch-oriented. Right? When there's new data that comes from the satellite, we can run them, but that data comes in bunches. It doesn't come continuously. There's also different cost models. In academia, at least in the US, using high-performance computing resources is free because they're provided by the government. But the cloud is not, because we have to pay for cloud cycles from Amazon or from anybody else. And we have to then think about, actually, how do we want to make these open and how do we want to support them? And so what we learned from this first model is that academia can leverage commercial systems and tools, but this isn't always the best option. And often for us, it's not a good option. Sometimes it is. We then started with a second model called Landsat Trends from an institute in Germany that basically, again, is doing machine learning and is looking at how lakes change, where there's been wildfires, where there have been slumps in the earth. And this project initially was running on Google Earth Engine, a commercial system, which gave access to these Landsat images, which are the satellite images that they were using. The developer wanted to use a version of scikit-learn with this to actually build his analysis, but Google Earth Engine didn't allow using that version of scikit-learn. So he had to change the first version of this to be driven by a script rather than driven by the Google Earth Engine GUI, graphic user interface. And we ended up building a workflow that takes data from Google's cloud and sends it to a high-performance computing resource at Illinois for processing, and then sends the results back to be put into this website. And part of our work was to be able to do this at scale, at large scale, on the high-performance computing resources. And so this then led to the second Permafrost Discovery Gateway set of data and service. And so what we learned from this is that while some data and tools and experiences are tied to specific infrastructure, this can't be consistent across a field. And so portability and interoperability are essential, and we have to work towards those. Okay, and then another thing that's happened about a year ago is this project won a $5 million award from Google.org. So Google said they wanted to find some interesting science examples where they could invest some money and improve them. And so this was one where we got this funding. This led to work on infrastructure to make creating and scaling models more easy for scientists. And we also got a bunch of fellows, people from Google corporate office that would come and work on this project. And so one of the things that happened with this is that we have a team internally that knows a lot about infrastructures and tools because we use a lot of different infrastructures and tools depending on what's cheap and what's available and what makes sense. The Google people only know Google, right? Because it's free for them and there's no reason for them to use anything else, and sometimes they're actually not supposed to use anything else. So they don't necessarily have experience with a lot of other things, but they're very willing to try. I mean, they're good people and they're willing to try these things. They're just not part of their daily job at Google. And so the lesson that came out of this is that working with industry can be challenging because the tooling and practices that they have are the ones that work for them. They're not necessarily the ones that work for academia or for science because they have the scale to build their own tools. And average scientists don't have the scale to build their own tools. So we as scientists have to use the tools that are available from a variety of sources. Okay, so in general, the Permafrost Discovery Gateway is a gateway. It's available. It openly shares data about permafrost now. There's two models that have been, that run there that I've talked about, and others are in development. We need to make sure that things run portably because the costs are going to change over time and where the data is going to change over time. And there's a bunch of different technologies from different developers that underlie this. The goal of the gateway is to make other models be able to be developed and to run at scale as well. And so we need to make the technologies available to the scientists so they can take their models and move them to this platform and to make the costs work for the platforms. And we want to get to a point where the team, researchers, governments, industry can contribute the data they have or the software they have or the models that they have and have all of this be openly shared. But in this vision, we don't actually know necessarily who's going to pay for the resources to share the data, to store the data, to share the models, to run the models. We don't know at this point how the average researcher will find out that this is available and how they'll figure out how to access it and how to contribute. And if this is going to be something that gets scaled, let's say we have hundreds of researchers that are running hundreds of models so we can compare them, we can't actually go out and work with hundreds of researchers. So we need to make sure that the hands-on part of this is as minimal as possible so people can pick this up themselves as much as they can. So the overall open vision here I think is really strong, but the details about the technologies and the interoperability and the costs are really hard, and I don't think we know the answers to a lot of these things yet. Right? We've started along the way, but there's some questions still. Okay, so using that as an example of open science, let me talk a little bit more generally. That I think we collectively want to collaborate. And generally, that's the reason we're in universities. That's the reason we're doing science, is we want to share what we're doing. And so open science is often described as the free sharing of scientific ideas and methods and results. Right? It's not just the results. It's the pieces along the way before the results as well. And it's not just science. It's what in German is called Wissenschaft. It's knowledge and scholarship. So it's besides science, it could be humanities, right? It could be engineering, it could be a lot of things that at least in English, the word science doesn't always describe, and scholarship is often a better term. And so this kind of sharing was originally done with letters that were handwritten and then with books, and it was mostly aimed at other scientists. And then about 400 years ago, we started having journals. And this then expanded the audience a little bit. It was still primarily scientists, but it could be more scientists. And then as we've had digitalization happen, this has expanded the opportunities for sharing, as well as the opportunities of what can be shared. So it's not just the article anymore, now it's the data or the software or the method or something else as well. And as research has been democratized, primarily through public funding, which mostly has been since World War II, and information sharing has grown since the 1960s, 70s, 80s. This has expanded the community and at least the audience that can be involved in learning. And so we've gotten to this idea of knowledge as a common good, a societal good. And we have this idea now of open science. And so just looking at this a little bit, I think open science was first documented in Science in 1882. But it didn't actually mean what we mean by open science today. It meant using the scientific method. It seems like the modern sense of open science came in the mid-1980s when there was a AAAS project on secrecy and openness in 1984. And as far as I can tell, that's where the idea of open science as we think of it today started. So we want to share things, but we also are competing. And we're competing because we live in this economic capitalist society, and this causes us to act in ways that don't necessarily match the sharing that we would like to do. And so economics really drives our lives and careers. And so economics, and a lot of times, determines where we work, it determines who we hire, determines how we support ourselves, and what case we make for promotion, how we actually get our funding, how we get supported, how we get recognized for what we've done, and how much work we put into being recognized. What science we do is often driven by economics. If there's a funding agency that says that they're going to put new money into an area, people will move into that area, even if it's not necessarily the area they most want to work in. Which students we train or take advantage of, depending on how you look at this. And so economics overall is described as the science of allocating scarce resources to maximize the achievement of competing ends. But this isn't always the case because some resources, right, like data, like publications that are electronic, can be increased without any cost. And so some of the scarce part isn't necessarily true, but we still kind of act as if it was. So we often then have this mix of competing and collaborating. And if you're trying to think about how to get people to collaborate, you can think that what you really want to get is engagement, whether this is citizen science, whether this is people working together on open source software, whether it's people sharing the data that they've produced. This engagement is some kind of a meaningful and valuable action that produces a measurable result. And it involves people that are going to choose when and where to come together to do something. And so we can define engagement as motivation and support minus friction. And so motivation has two parts: the intrinsic motivation, that's the things just inside of you that make you want to get involved in something, and then the extrinsic things, the pressures on the outside that give you some reward if you actually do these things. There's also support, which are the things that other people can do to make it easier for you, to make it more valuable for you. And then there's friction, which are the kind of the external things that make it harder. So this could be the technology doesn't actually give you a way to share your 1 terabyte data set because we don't have anywhere that we can do that. We can only share smaller data sets or something like that. Or you don't have the knowledge of how to share the paper you've written with the people that you think really would want to read it. Okay, so I said we don't collaborate partly because of the capitalist system, but we also don't collaborate for some other reasons. And some of those are that sharing something takes some energy, some effort, but the immediate benefits of doing that sharing actually go to the people you share with, right? They don't go to you initially. They do in the long term, but not immediately. People are often embarrassed about the details. So if you ask people why they don't share their software, one of the common answers is that I'm not confident that I wrote it very well, and I don't want other people to see how badly I wrote it. Sometimes it's that you don't want to support others. Right? If you give somebody something, they may ask questions about it, and then you may spend time answering those questions, and that may not be what you want to do. The mechanisms of how we do the sharing are new, and they're not how we work traditionally. So if you are, let's say you're a professor and you've been working as a professor for, 20 or 30 years, you probably didn't learn this. And so it's not in your habit, and so you may have to kind of work to change how you do things. The metrics for how we can evaluate products that are shared are underdeveloped. So if you share something, there's not necessarily good ways of measuring how effective that sharing is that then are going to reward you. There's intellectual property laws in some cases that may right, caused your university to say, no, you shouldn't share that. We want to make money from it instead. There's commercial entities that profit from restricting access. So if you're publishing with Elsevier, for example, right, they're making money because they own your work. And if your work was free, they wouldn't make that money. So that's just an example, but there's a lot of other examples as well. And then we also have nonprofit scientific societies. So I work I'm on the board of governors of the IEEE Computer Society, and we're dependent on journal subscription fees for a lot of the other things we do. So if we were to make journal subscription fees go away, we wouldn't actually have money to support students to come to things. We wouldn't have money to help organize meetings and other things. So there's kind of both good and bad incentives necessarily for how this works. Okay, so let me give you another example. I talked about a big gateway with data and software. Now I want to talk about a pretty small software tool. And this is the Next Generation Sequencing Analysis Toolkit, or NEAT. So NEAT started by a PhD student who was working with the Mayo Clinic at Illinois. He developed software to leverage long-read sequencing data in order to help understand some aspects of diseases and their causes in a way that conventional approaches couldn't. And so basically he was trying to examine DNA and RNA to find variants that might be the causes of diseases. And he published this work in a journal in 2016. And he shared the second version of the software on GitHub and made it available. And then he graduated. And so this work takes, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Sorry, I don't know how many people are in this area, but I am not, and so I'll go through it quickly. So it takes a reference sequence in a standard format. It creates some variants, and it adds them according to some input parameters that it's been given. It outputs then sequences of what a sequencing machine might read if that data actually had been given to a sequencing, if the samples had been given to a sequencing machine. And it also creates a golden file of the sequence variants that inserted, and a golden file showing how that ideally should be aligned, what should come out of this process. And so the idea then is that researchers can run these output files that have been created through their own alignment program, and they can compare them with the golden results to see how good of a job they've done. And this software then actually produces a ground truth for benchmarking. If you have a new tool but you don't know what the answer is supposed to be, this gives you a way of saying, here's some input and here's some output that you're supposed to have, and that lets you test your new tool. And it learns from inputting organisms. So if you're looking at something that's non-human research, this can be particularly useful. And a lot of bioinformatics tools are designed specifically for humans, and they may not handle differences in other organisms so well. And there's also very few human genomes that are publicly available due to privacy issues. And so this tool then can simulate data that can be used to test software and do benchmarking in situations where we don't have data or where the human data might not be ethically available to be used. So I said the original author graduated. And so new developers and maintainers were needed, and we brought in a developer, Josh Allen, who's on the side, and some NCSA staff to work on this, and some undergraduates. The software was on Python 2, which was going away, and so it had to be converted to Python 3. The software started to be used by some labs that were pretty happy with it, but they needed user support in order to keep using it and do more things. And the developers then had to do a bunch of work, including refactoring the code, adding package management, restructuring the code to submodules that were called by a central command, and then converting what was done on the command line to what could be done for an input file to make it more reproducible and more debuggable. And we did all of this without any external funding, which was a bit of a challenge. We had some small internal grants that could pay for some undergraduates to do testing and work on some small projects. When the software was used, it was often mentioned and it was usually cited. But the current developers weren't ever named on those citations because they cited the 2016 paper, which was done before any of the current developers. So there was no incentive for the current developers to actually work on it from that point of view. So where we are now is that this software is public, version 4 on GitHub. It's open to contributions, but having something on GitHub, just making it open source isn't enough. You actually also have to build a community of users, developers and maintainers, and that's part of what I was talking about in that idea of engagement. So how do people actually get engaged with the software? And so one thing is that the team is trying to add a module to the connected analytics platform from Illumina. with the idea then that all the people that are using this platform then will be able to use this, and maybe some of them will want to contribute to it as well. We also have to consider other aspects, how this software gets archived for reproducibility, how people actually find, access, and use the software. And we're pursuing collaborations with scientists in different areas where this project potentially could be funded so that it could be added to that specific use case, but some of the funding would go for general maintenance of the software. So this is the way that we're hoping to maintain the software over time, is by getting funding for some use cases and having a little bit of that funding then go into the general maintenance. Okay, so now that I've talked about research software a little bit, let me go into that in a little more detail. So one question is why do we actually care about research software? We can look at a few different aspects. One of them is we can look at funding. And we found that 20% of National Science Foundation in the US projects over 11 years topically discussed software in their abstracts. So this was about $10 billion that was going into these projects. The Department of Energy in the US has something called the Exascale Computing Program, and it has 3 main areas, 2 of which are software. The software that happens below the applications, I could find a budget number for, that was $400 million in the last year. There's also the application software, which I couldn't actually find a budget number for. I looked at NIH, National Institutes of Health projects, and I found that from 3 years ago up to the last year, there were $400 million, $410 million, $500 million of funding going into projects that said that they were doing software development explicitly. So not just projects using software, but projects developing software. And when we looked at the Australia Research Council, we found that 47% of the grants that they made between 2010 and 2019 produced software. So almost half of the projects they funded produced software as part of their project. If we look at publications, we can see that current publications, a majority of them are software-intensive projects where you can look at them and you can see the software that was used in them. And the most cited papers are either papers about a method or they're papers about a software package that often is implementing a method. And then if we ask researchers, and we've done this in the US and the UK, we find that 90%, greater than 90% of these researchers say that they use research software. About 65% wouldn't be able to do their research without it, and about 50% develop software as part of their research. And it's nice this 50% actually kind of reinforces the Australia number from before as well. And then finally, we can say, at least in computer science and computing, the areas that are kind of the hot areas today depend on research software. So AI, in terms of both training and inference, is almost entirely software-based and how those are done. And quantum, which may be the next area in the future, depends on software in terms of actually the research and the modeling of the hardware and the physics, but also the programming and how you actually take these noisy systems and get useful information out of them. I guess, sorry, I should have mentioned the URL that's on the bottom of this is these slides. So if you're interested in getting any of these things that are actually very hard to read on the screen, that are the kind of the citations and the data, you can click on any of these things once you go there. So I talked about research software. Research software itself shows up in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's part of an instrument. Sometimes it is the instrument. So some instruments are just software, where software is enabling some others to work. Sometimes research software is the thing that analyzes the data. Sometimes it's the thing that produces the research result. Sometimes it's the glue that puts together a bunch of components into a whole. Sometimes it's the infrastructure or the underlying tool underneath. And sometimes it's the method of facilitating the collaboration. If we think about then how research software and research should go together, at least my vision, is that all research software that can be is open, that all research software is high quality and robust, that all research software is findable, accessible, and usable, and it actually is used by others for their own research, and when it's used, it's cited, so the developers are getting credit for it, that all contributors to research software are recognized for their work, and they have good careers, whether they're in universities or national labs or government or industry, that all research software continues to be available as long as it's still useful to a community, that all research is reproducible, whether it's depending on research software or not, and when it does, the research software helps it become reproducible. And all of these things are overlapping in terms of incentives and policies, and really they all start with a recognition of research software as part of open science and as part of the way we do scholarship today. So one of the problems we have is that software collapses. And this is the fact that software stops working eventually if it's not actively maintained. And most software that shows up in computational or data science has a stack that's behind it, a set of layers. And at the bottom of that is some infrastructure that's not really intended for the science. It's something like operating systems or compilers or support code or user interfaces. And on top of that are things that are scientific, things like libraries and utilities that are useful for research in a lot of different disciplines. And then on top of that is often discipline-specific software. So things that are tools and libraries that implement some kind of a discipline method or a model. And then on top of that is really the project-specific software, the thing that's specific about the question the researcher is asking. And this could be a script or a workflow or a computational notebook or something else. And so the problem here is that this software is building and depending on the software and all the layers below it. And so if any change happens, this can cause everything to stop working. So your script may stop working because the operating system has changed, for example, or the compiler has changed, or the library that you're using has changed. So there's a bunch of different problems that can happen here, and they all do happen over time because nothing in software is fixed. Everything is always changing, at least at some rate. So we have this idea of research software that's developed and used for the purpose of research to generate, process, analyze results within the scholarly process. It's increasingly essential, but there are challenges. And as I said, software collapses if it's not actively maintained. Software bugs are found, and new features are needed, and there's new platforms. We went from CPUs to GPUs. Maybe we'll go to quantum next. We don't know exactly. Software development and maintenance is human intensive. We don't actually have AI systems that can do this for us, even though people maybe are working on that, and maybe we will one day, but we don't today. And there are human challenges as well. So software that's developed is developed often specifically for research, and it's developed by researchers. And researchers in many fields know their disciplines incredibly well, but they don't know software best practices quite often. Okay. And researchers are not rewarded for the software development and maintenance work that they're doing in academia. And finally, developers don't match the overall diversity of society or of user communities. So we're missing large numbers of people in society that could be working on software. We're missing them in research in general. We're missing them in universities in general. But even within a university where we get some diversity, we do even worse once we get to software. Okay, so I'm going to define software sustainability then as just the fact that the software endures, that it keeps working over time. Will the software continue to be available in the future on new platforms meeting new needs? And this is something that you can only measure going backwards. You can't say that software is going to be sustainable. You can say software has been sustained up to today. Right? This is like financial modeling, right? Where you can say this model works for I don't know, a mutual fund in the past, but you can't say that the model is going to continue working into the future. Software maintenance and development is human. Human effort is kind of equivalent to money, but not exactly. We can have projects that are entirely human effort based, like community open source projects, and we know that those work. We can have projects that are entirely funded by money and salary, whether that's commercial software or grant-funded projects, and we know that those work. When we try to mix the two is where things get hard. So if we have people that are being funded by a company to work on software and they ask for volunteers to come and work as well, those volunteers may say, why should I do that when you're getting paid? So there's questions about that. And there probably are answers that actually make sense, but the first answer may not be the right one. So people are not purely rational, and they don't take their effort and exactly tie it to money. So again, research software sustainability is the process of developing and maintaining software over time, including that the software adds new capabilities as needed by its users, it responds to bugs and other problems that are discovered, and it's ported to work with new versions of the underlying layers, including software as well as new hardware. So there's some solutions to this that we can think about. One is creating incentives so that people want to work on software. One part of this may be citations that help people that are in existing career paths. So if people are professors and part of what they are recognized for is their citations, if their software is used, that gives them more citations. That might be something that incentivizes them to work more on software. And I'm going to talk about that in one of three pieces coming up. Another is adjusting existing career paths to reward software work. So if we're advertising for a new professor, and there's a list of things that are qualifications for that, maybe one of them should be, has worked on open source software. Right? We may think about the same thing in terms of promotion. We can think about new career paths. And I'm going to talk about this in the second piece, so I'll save that for the minute. We can talk about increasing available funding by making the role of software in research clear to funders. So going out to FAPESP or to NSF or to somebody else and saying software is important, having researchers say that, and trying and insisting that they put more money into software over time. As well as making sure that they're putting money into software maintenance so that the software is not just built, but it actually continues, it is sustained. And I'll talk about that as the third and last of the three pieces. And then another thing that can be done is to seek institutional resources. So if there's software that's being developed here and there's a lot of people using it, maybe the university can put a little bit of money into maintaining it because the university is seen as the home of the software and it helps the university's reputation. And maybe it helps the university actually compete in this area as well. Maybe it makes its research better in some area. Encouraging collaboration, encouraging software reuse leads to less recreating and more adding. And so there's often not a good reason to build multiple versions of a software package when you could just add a feature to that package. But again, the incentives don't necessarily align that way right now. So if we could make existing software more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, which is fair, which often is talked about in data but isn't talked about as much in software, that would be another way of doing this. Okay, so let me give one third and final example, then I'll move on to the three pieces relatively quickly. So this example is called Muses. It's the modular unified solver of the equation of state. So this is work that goes on in basically nuclear physics, astrophysics, computational relativistic fluid dynamics, gravitational wave, computational astrophysics, where a bunch of different underlying equations are actually very similar, but they're being solved in different regimes of validity. And some of the theories have some overlap, but generally the theories are kind of specified for one particular regime of temperature and density. So there is a group that has a goal of modernizing and publishing legacy code and creating new modules that work for calculating equations of state and derived observable quantities for experiments and simulation. And what they're trying to do is to build a software framework where researchers can create calculation models that then can be used in standardized data processing workflows. And they want to connect computer scientists and physicists to develop new numerical methods to interpolate between these solution spaces and maybe to enable new physics discoveries. And they also want to do this through a science gateway, a calculation engine that would let the research community use and leverage high-performance computing resources to do this more easily. So the way that this works just at a very high level is that we have research facilities like LIGO and the relativistic heavy ion collider and the Large Hadron Collider and other things that are producing data. And we also have theory. And the theory then is feeding these software packages that are doing modeling. And if we can bring the modeling and the theory together into these observable packages, we can then say, does the data actually match the models? Should we be changing things? What can we learn from this? And so that's basically the idea of what this is trying to do, but across these different areas that typically have been seen as different areas with small overlaps, trying to see how do they all actually work together and where they can. So there's a bunch of challenges for this. One of them is to actually help people across countries and within a country collaborate effectively. And so this project has built a set of collaboration tools that are based on decentralized open source solutions. I'm not going to go through these, but there's this Decent CI is the kind of name for this set of tools, and they're trying to push this out to other collaborations as well outside of this particular physics area. They're also trying to figure out how to do this best in terms of actually hosting the platform and doing the development. And they're now doing things on OpenStack, on a cloud, using a GitOps paradigm with containers and Kubernetes, which are kind of the standards for working in this area. And they have an automated process to describe the infrastructure that they want to deploy in a configuration file and then be able to automatically deploy that configuration and that infrastructure. They're supporting dozens of researchers, from professors to postdocs to graduate and undergraduate students to scientists, from a lot of different places, so this is where a lot of the communication pieces come in. There's actually the software development itself, so how to actually create these new algorithms for physics calculations, how to translate and improve code that was originally written in old languages like Fortran, although I like Fortran, but some people don't, and particularly new students often don't have any idea what it is, and so that can be a challenge in finding people. Designing the science gateway that actually has an API, application programming interface, that's robust and flexible, and uses workflow management systems that are compatible with a lot of different kinds of systems, including clouds and other things. And then credit, and how developers and maintainers of the system and the software should actually be credited. And this is currently done by publishing traditional papers and asking people to cite them, but ideally this system is going to cite the modules that are used when somebody runs a workflow and say, here are the things you used, these are the citations you should add to your paper. And some of those will be papers. Ideally, as we go forward, some of them will be software, some of them will be data sets. And finally is the question about sustainability. So this is a 5-year funded project to develop this. So what actually then will happen to all of this after the 5 years? And this is a challenge that the team is currently working on. Okay, so I'll go through the 3 things that I wanted to mention. The first one being citation. In 2015, we started a working group on software citation. What we ended up doing was to document the differences between software and data, because data citation was already starting to take off, but software citation wasn't, and to define a set of challenges related to software citation. And so we documented the differences between software and data, we documented the challenges. We created a set of software citation principles, and those principles include that the software is seen as important, that it is, the citations facilitate giving credit to the developers, that the software is uniquely identified, that it is persistent, the citation stays around and the metadata stays around even if the software is no longer active, that the citation helps you actually access the software, and that the citation tells you the specific version of the software that was used in the work that you're citing it from. After that, we started a second working group on implementing the citation principles. And what we thought we were going to do is to write out a little bit of detail that was needed for people to go off and implement the principles and to coordinate a bunch of different work that was going on and to work with communities to actually get this to happen. We very quickly realized that what we thought was a small amount of detail wasn't small, and that scattered progress was being made, but there were underlying challenges that nobody was addressing because they were too big for anybody to address individually. And so we wrote up what those challenges were, and they include the fact that software is very complex in terms of the number of types and the identifiers. Right? Software can be source code, it can be in a container, it can be an executable, it can be a package, it can be on a repository. There's a lot of different identifiers. There's questions about where metadata gets stored. And then there's social challenges related to how groups actually do this. Do they work within a discipline? Do they work within a conference? Do they work through a publisher? Do they work through a registry or a repository? How do indexers get involved? How do funders get involved? How do institutions get involved? We created task forces to work on these things, and so we had a guidance task force that created checklists for authors who want to cite software and for developers who want to make their software citable. We created a task force to take a metadata project that was working on metadata for software and to update it and to describe everything that was in it using schema.org properties, because schema.org was becoming the standard that was being used for metadata in a bunch of different areas. And then to move this group to become a community group that had a governance structure, so it had a way of answering questions and changing things over time. We created a registries task force to look at how registries and repositories that store software actually work, and to give them a set of best practices. And that turned into a paper, 9 best practices, and it also turned into a community that meets monthly and talks about this with other members of the community. And we started a journals task force, where we worked with publishers to provide them with generic guidelines that they could use for how to cite software, and they would then specify, kind of make those generic guidelines specific for different journals or different conferences using examples that made sense to those communities. And we also worked on publication processing, which is the fact that once a citation gets to a journal, it then has to go through a bunch of processing before it ends up in an index. like Web of Science or Scopus or something else. And software was getting lost in that process, and so it wasn't necessarily showing up in the index. So we figured out a little bit about why and gave some ideas about how to fix that. We wanted to have an institutions task force. We're thinking about institutions as places where people work. And the idea was that this would affect policies and practices in those institutions, like how those policies and practices encourage software citation, how they use that information in hiring and promotion. But we didn't actually get enough interest to do this, and so this kind of stopped for a while. But I'll talk about something in a little bit about that's taking up part of this again. And then finally, we decided to look at just wrapping up where we were, kind of writing down what we'd done, thinking about what else could be done and who could do it. And so we had a software citation workshop 2 years ago and wrote a report from that. And then the working group ended, and we're currently working on a blog post that would suggest topics that need more work and venues in which people can come together to do that work. I also want to mention the Journal of Open Source Software, which Alfredo mentioned briefly. The Journal of Open Source Software is intended to help fix some of these issues in the short term. So it's a developer-friendly journal for research software packages. What we say is that if you have code and you've already licensed it and have good documentation, it should take you less than an hour to prepare and submit a paper based on that software. And everything about JOSS is open. It's diamond open access, meaning there's no charge to publish and no charge to read. There's a short paper and software that goes with it. The reviews in the process are open, collaborative, and iterative. So you know who's reviewing your work. You can chat with them. They can tell you, this doesn't make sense to me. You can go back and say, well, this is why it does, or I can fix that, or something else. So it's kind of a nice process. It basically, we follow the process that's used in software, basically, as opposed to the adversarial process that's used in publication more often. JOSS papers are archived, and they have DOIs, and they're indexed. The first paper was in 2016. That's when we started this. In 2017, we had about 100 papers at that point. The last time, I guess I updated this, we had about 2,300 papers. It's actually close to 2,400 or 2,500 now. We're at about 1.1 papers a day and slowly increasing. So this is actually a fair amount of work, but it's something that the community has bought into and is being used. We had 1 editor-in-chief and 11 editors when we started. We now have 1 editor-in-chief, 6 associate and track editors, 84 editors, and 41 emeritus editors that have finished 1 or 2 or maybe multiple terms and have given up, have retired. Okay, so the second thing then, research software engineers. This is the career path part. So I said before, a significant fraction of research software comes from research. This has really happened from the beginning of computing. Software appeared about 1948, as best I can tell. Research software started a couple of years later, looking at weather initially. Software engineering started in the late 1960s, but it was mostly applied to operational software. Researchers, often faculty, again, as I mentioned, generally don't know what the best software practices are. They know what works, but they maybe could do things better. Software engineers often know exactly how to build software, but they don't understand how research works. And so the idea then is that we have some students and postdocs who don't know good software practices at the beginning. They may learn some along the way, but they don't usually stick around, right? They graduate, they move on. Some postdocs do stay. They may join the staff, they may become faculty. This may be unofficial, they may be called a postdoc for a very long time. But eventually we do get some staff members who have a research understanding and have developed software engineering skills. And so we can think about this in some sense as 2 different pieces kind of coming together. We have the scholar, who's the researcher who's driven to understand things to their fullest capacity. Right? They find intellectually demanding problems. They do these in a curiosity-driven way. They work on a topic until they feel like they understand it well enough, and then they pass on that understanding through teaching often. And then we have craftspeople, who are driven to create and leave behind something that explains what they've done. These are the people that are unhappy when they make something that's more fragile or ugly than they think it should be. They prefer to make things that explain themselves. And they do this work that requires patience and have a pride in doing this job well. And so the answer then is that scientific software or research software requires people who understand both of these things and have some aspect of both of these in their lives. And I'll just point out that this was in a blog post from 2012. So this is kind of when this idea started being tossed around, about 12 years ago. So a research software engineer then, if we think of a space that has research on one axis and software engineering on the other axis, and we can think about people that are great researchers but don't know software, and people who are great software engineers but don't know research, there are also then people who are researcher developers, and this may be some of the people here or who are watching, who are very good researchers and decent developers. And the idea is that maybe there's something that's kind of in between these even a little bit more. People who maybe don't know a research area as well, but do know software engineering a bit better and can do it more generally. And this is kind of a cloud. It's not a single point. So some RSEs know more software than others, some know more research than others, but they all have this mix of the understanding the two. So in 2012, there was a workshop in the UK called the Collaborations Workshop. And in this workshop, a working group went off and they discovered that a lot of people were doing this kind of work already, but they didn't have a common title. So they looked through UK HR systems and they found 194 different job titles that all included some of this research software development. So they said, let's use research software engineer or RSE as the title. Let's agree on that. It may not be the best thing, but if we all agree on it and use it, it'll have some weight and it'll carry something. They realized that there was no community of these people, and so they started building an association, which is later turned into a society. And they realized that this was not a profession, and it wasn't seen as a profession. So they started working on a career path. How could somebody come in? What would they need to know at the beginning? What could they be promoted as? What would the structure of this look like? So in 12 years, we have this movement and this term that was born in the UK. About a year into this, in 2013, there was an association that started with 50 members. This is now a professional society, a nonprofit with about 700 dues-paying members and about 5,300 people overall. There also are similar societies in Belgium, Germany, the Netherlands, Nordic countries, Australia, New Zealand, and in the US. We have about 2,500 members in the US. We started in 2018, roughly. Didn't really start getting people until 2019, and then we've been growing. There's new associations forming in Africa and in Asia that are kind of prototype associations trying to build together enough community to start an association. And these associations then can work on local issues within their own country or their own region collectively, and then they can coordinate more globally where there's a need for that as well, which also happens. And then about a year ago, I discovered that in France, there's something called Devlog, which is a national network of research software engineers that was created in 2011, 1 year before the UK group that started. And some of these local networks that were brought together into this national network had been around actually for a longer period beyond that. And so it was interesting to find out that this group that for 12 years, a bunch of us thought that this activity had started in the UK, and we found out, no, it actually had been going on in France before that. But the problem was that the group in France does everything in French. All the other groups work professionally in English, even if English isn't the language that they work in necessarily for everything, but it's the language that they're using to communicate outside. And so the French and the English RSE worlds didn't actually know about each other and were completely disconnected. So we're now trying to figure out how do we actually bridge these together. And I don't know what the answer is because I don't think the Devlog group is going to change to work in English. And I don't think the English groups are going to change to work in French, but hopefully we can do some things that are in between and get somewhere. Okay, the third thing and last thing that I want to talk about then is research software funding. We have something called the Research Software Alliance, or RISA, that we've started a few years ago. And the vision of research is that research software and the people that develop and maintain it are recognized and valued as fundamental and vital to research worldwide. The mission of research of RISA is to advance the research software ecosystem by collaborating with key influencers and decision makers, founded in 2019. What we've been doing then in RISA is to facilitate global forum and discussions, do some analysis of relevant issues, identify community priorities, and create task forces. And so we have had a task force that we started recently on research software policy for research institutions. And so this is the thing that I was talking about before in the citation world where we didn't get the institutional part to go ahead. Now we have a different way of getting the institutional part to go ahead, not focused on citation, but focused on research software more generally, as well as research software authorship. We co-led the drafting of the FAIR for Research Software Principles. As I mentioned before, the idea of FAIR coming out of data needed to be modified for software, and RISA co-led that activity. with about 500 community members. And we've had a bunch of different groups adopting this, so we think that this is getting good support at this point. There's a task force that's now going on code availability for publishers, where we get publishers to talk together about how do they ask people to make their code available for review and for reproducibility. We're co-leading initiatives in Africa and Asia and just starting one in Latin America, which maybe we can talk about afterwards, to identify the research software community leaders in different countries and different regions and help them get involved in shaping international and intellectual dialogue. So helping give people the information that they can use within their own country, as well as understanding what's going on in countries that we just haven't necessarily seen as much, because the focus may be on national publishing versus global publishing, for example. So if you're interested in being involved in RISA, you can get a newsletter, you can join a Slack. We have a funding call database where we try to list globally all of the calls that are available to support research software. And so you can suggest things to be added, or you can see if there's something from FAPESP or from somebody else that's in there. And then we also have these task forces on specific activities. So as I said, we've created and maintained this funding opportunities database. Both researchers and funders can contribute it and can browse it. And when RISA formed, this idea of research software funding was one of the first things that came up as a topic. And we found that funders wanted to exchange experiences and find ways that they could work together to have greater impact on research software. Fabio was one of the people that was involved in this, and that was great. There's, I would guess, about 35 different groups that are involved now. And so these funders can be government, they can be philanthropic, or they can be industry. There are people who want to support research software, or the people who develop and maintain it, by giving some monetary or in-kind support without expecting a service or tangible benefit back. So this isn't a company that's paying somebody to develop software for that company. It's a company that's providing funding for software that's going to be an open resource. And we created this funders forum to bring together these funders, and we have virtual meetings every 6 weeks. And we also have gathered them in person twice, and there will be a third meeting coming up in Sweden in September. And one of the things that came out of this is something called the Amsterdam Declaration on Funding Research Software Sustainability, or adore.software. And adore.software is the website if you want to see this as well. We had 45 funding organizations that were available when we brought in a draft, and we had a lot of feedback from that draft, and it changed quite a bit. We then created a version 1 of the declaration in Montreal a year ago, and this is the version that's available on the website. And we have a stewardship group that has representatives of the signatories that's responsible for the endorsement process, which is started and is moving ahead. As I mentioned, there's a third funders workshop coming up in Sweden this September. If anybody is a funder and is interested in going to this, let me know, and we can talk about what would make sense in terms of participation. Some of this will also have some virtual components, so some things will be streamed. I'm not completely sure how much yet. So that's where we are. Today, research software is increasingly important to research. Citation is the accepted mechanism for scholarly credit in academia, and software citation is beginning to be accepted, and it's having some uptake from researchers and publishers and librarians. Software papers are partially a placeholder for software citation, but they also have an important community function in terms of community norms and standards. Research software engineers is now being recognized as a role, but it has a long history, and we're now building community and making a case for formal career paths. In terms of funding, we have some research funders who understand the importance of research software. Again, I would say FAPESP has been one of these. They have policies and programs that support it, different ones with more or less success and more or less funding and more or less ambition. And the funders are communicating with each other about best practices, which I think is pretty important. So if you're interested in this, some things that you can do are to promote software sharing and credit. So if you're an author of a paper, please cite the software you use. If you're developing software, make it easy to cite. Tell people how they should cite it. If you're reviewing a paper, if you're reviewing a funding request, if you're reviewing a conference talk, demand that software be cited in the thing that you're reviewing. You can support research software engineers. You can consider how your organization actually does this today. and if there's something that you could do to change it, to make it better. Again, you can work through these to the US organization or the UK society to get ideas or to get connected into these activities. You can work to make sure software is included in hiring and promotion for everyone that has any aspect of software. So if you're involved in hiring a new professor, maybe you can try to make sure that the job advertisement and the statement says something about software, for example. And maybe you can't do this for one job, but maybe you have to work with the Human Resources Office to try to do this in the category. But again, hopefully this is something that can be done. You can promote the Adore.software, the software declaration. You can look at the 12 principles in the declaration. I think that everybody will agree that all of these are good. I'd be surprised if anybody working on software has any disagreement with them. We have the fact that the open science community in general, the open software community, the citation community, the research software engineering community, and RESA itself are all open. And you can join any of these and get involved if this is something that's interesting to you. And overall, the thing that I would ask for anybody who's here, anybody that's watching, is to try to work to raise the awareness of research software as an element of research. It's worth understanding that research software is not the same as business software. It has different goals, it has different incentives, different methods, different practices, it needs a different workforce and has different education. And there should be aspects of some of those that you can work on in projects that you're working on as well. So with that, I will just say that there's a lot of different people that have contributed to this. I am slightly involved in the Permafrost Discovery Gateway. I'm not involved in NEAT or Muses, but the people that are working on these at NCSA and elsewhere were very helpful in giving me information about these. And a lot of different people have been involved in a lot of these different groups. And so I'll just leave a bunch of names up and say that I also write a blog, although my posting has become less frequent over time. But I'm a little bit more active on Mastodon, which is the replacement for Twitter in the science community, in my opinion. So thank you. Yeah, please. Yeah, I'll repeat. So, yes.
Yes, very much with all those. Very, very dense and very good. Thank you. I was wondering, from a management point of view, the 25 million budget that you guys have from this foundation, how much percent is spending on staff, that's a huge staff, how much percent is SG&A, as in marketing, how to attract people, how to give views, and how much percent is in actual infrastructure like cloud and the second one is, so you point the challenge is the human capital. Everybody can agree that the problem is human capital, but good software developers, the cost of opportunity is too high to stay doing research in academia. They go to the industry, they're going to get a lot more money. And usually software, everybody thinks that they're just, but there's very few people that are very good at software. And those people that are good at science, they overlap with the good software. So if they move from industry, they're gonna have a very good career path. So for maintaining them at that, and also doing like in their free time, like open source stuff, they really have to love that. So I understand that work in physics, because people in physics, they know how to code, they're good coders, and they have that mentality. But for bioinformatics, no. Thank you. But for biology, biologists don't know how to code at all, and they never will, because that's not how they are. And people who do bioinformatics usually are not very, there's a lot of good people, but usually they are not very good at coding or biology. So it's important to maintain the structure working and to be as good as relevant as in physics. It must have some company behind it and must be more professionalized than the open source structure, because I don't think it's sustainable. So what do you think? Do you think it's maintainable in bioinformatics field, this open source structure that works very well in the physics and natural science?
Yeah, so I think the answer likely to the last question, kind of about human capital and how it works with science and industry and academia. Maybe I'll say a few things and hopefully I'll answer your question as I'm doing that. So I think one of them is that first, when we think about these career paths like research software engineering, the reason that we are doing this is that there are people who like software, who like research, who don't want to go to industry. right? They don't want their contribution to the world to be that 3 more people clicked on this advertisement, right? They want their contribution to be that we have some better understanding of this disease or this physical mechanism or something else. But they're potentially, as you say now, driven by a career path, driven by money, driven by something else to go off to where they can to have a life that is personally satisfying, even if it's not professionally the thing that they 100% want to do. So we think that the idea of these research software engineers is one way of actually addressing this. And we've had people that have come from industry to my university and to other universities taken a salary cut because they're more interested in being involved in the end goal that they want than in having the highest salary that they can. So I think that this is a positive sign and is making some impact. It's probably not the answer. Industry is always going to have higher salaries than academia. And so I think we just have to live with that and to say that salary is not the only thing. There's also, right, happiness with life, happiness with what you're doing. So I think that's one part. In terms of physics and in the history of software that's happened in physics quite successfully, I believe that the areas, physics and astronomy as well, where often large groups of people have to come together to build an infrastructure that's complex and expensive, has driven better recognition of the infrastructures in those fields. So I feel like in astronomy, people understand the importance of telescopes and mirrors and optics and instrumentation and other things, and similarly in physics, whether it's LHC or LIGO or any of these big experiments, and small ones as well. And so because of that, I would say that kind of collective feeling and the feeling that people have to do things themselves because there's not a commercial use for the telescope or for the particle accelerator, I think that's led the field to reward software in a way that doesn't happen in other fields, to see it as a key part of what happens. And that then leads into people being educated in it, people, graduate students who, in the case of the LHC, maybe go to the LHC and they have some kind of an operational role, some kind of a software role in addition to their research or their application role. So I think that these communities have seen this in a different way than other communities. So let's say bioinformatics, for example, there's a lot of good software that's being developed. It's being developed by a relatively small fraction of the bioinformatics community. In some ways that could be because there's a much larger commercial aspect where the sequencers have a big commercial role in addition to a research role. In some ways it could be just because the group is so big of people compared to physics that you don't necessarily need as many people to build software. But I would agree with you that it's less recognized there and it's less taught there. And so again, I would say that the RSE side, the research software engineer side, is something that can help with that. Because you can take RSEs that understand some area. So one example is somebody that understands bioinformatics that also can work in linguistics, right? Because it's different kinds of sequencing, but some of the methods and some of the algorithms can be the same, or the other way around. Or somebody that understands data science really well maybe can apply that to bioinformatics to some of the data challenges. So I think the answer is that there are some people that are developing very good software. We can try to create better education for the people that want to do that, and we can try to create career paths for them where they can stay in academia if they want to do that. If they want to go to industry, that's fine. Some certainly will, maybe the majority will. But if that happens, maybe then we think about a pipeline model where the job of the university is to train the students, to use the students while they're there, maybe to use the postdocs while they're there. After that, they may become faculty. More likely, they'll go into industry. But we take advantage of them, and we have a continuous process, and we always have enough people to do the work. And so that may be the model that we get to. I don't know the answer to that exactly. On your first question related to, I think that was the google.org grant that you were asking about specifically, or was it a more general question?
It was general because I think you guys, you told in the beginning, the first slide, that you have like a 55 million a budget for the whole, a year,
okay,
for the whole program for the 10 institutions. Right?
Okay, yeah, so all of the funding that I talked about there was software funding. It was not infrastructure funding. There is separate infrastructure funding for the computing and for some of the other things like that. So this was all on the software side. I would guess, and this is really a guess, is that 90% of these projects, maybe it's even higher than 90%, say that the output that they are doing is the science. It's the paper, it's the research. And 10% or less than 10% say that the output that they're creating is the software. So I think in general, people say that they're answering a scientific question and they need to build software along the way in order to answer that question. How the funding actually gets split up, I don't have a good answer for that at all. And again, there are this smaller fraction, which I would say is less than 10%, and maybe much less than 10%, of people who say, I want a grant to build software, and this software is not something that I'm going to use in this grant, but it's something that I'm going to make available for other people to use. And the argument that they make and that funders make is that doing that leads to more professional work on that software, and having that software available is much more cost effective than having 100 different science groups all try to build versions of that software themselves. So this is part of the question of the funding arguments that we're trying to make, is to increase the amount that goes into things that are specifically software for other people to use versus the things that are kind of done as coincidentally software for a project. But even for the ones that, let's say that I'm trying to do a electromagnetics problem, and I build some software to help me do this analysis. There's a question then about what happens to the software after the analysis is done. Right? Do I keep this in my research group and give it to just the graduate students to use, and this becomes a competitive advantage for our group potentially? Do I make this public where it's no longer an advantage for our group, but it helps the wider community, and that might be better for everybody, but it maybe isn't as good for me unless I get credit for doing that because people that are using my software are citing it, and I became known as the expert in this. So there's a lot of questions about that, and so I would say that's actually the problem that the funding agencies have a harder time addressing, is the fact that there is a lot of software that's built in regular grants, but it doesn't necessarily get used in the best way for the community.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have other questions?
So thank you, Daniel, for your exciting talk and showing directions that we should follow. And just to remember, today at 2 p.m., we are going to have a Q&A with Daniel at Instituto de Estudos Avançados, Auditório Alfredo Bossi. And over there, you have the chance to discuss what's happening and ask for questions. We do not always have the answers, but we'll try to do our best to discuss and find directions. So I hope to see you at the EA this afternoon at 2 p.m. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, welcome everyone. Now we are continuing the activities to let know people how software is important, how to maintain software is important as an activity for open science and to do research. And now we have time to have more interactive conversations with Daniel. So Daniel Katz, again, thank you for coming. And I will start with a question. You said in the morning about the importance of research software, because almost all research done today uses software in somehow and has software artifacts. And my question is how to try to increase the awareness about this importance in a top 100 university like ours.
So if it was possible, I think there's lots of different things that could be done. And the challenge is that there's not so much time for any person to do them all. So the way that I think about this is often by thinking about who are the stakeholders and how do we find them and how do we talk to them. And so as I was talking about in the morning, one of the groups of stakeholders is the funders. And so I think we've done a decent job of starting to talk to funders. The idea is that if we can get funders better aligned with this, then they'll provide more funding. And by providing more funding, that then will be a sign to the larger community that the funder thinks that this is important and that there's an opportunity to do something in this area. I don't know how things work here, but again, in the US, if a funder creates a new program and has new money, people will start working in that area. And so I think that's one of the things. Or if there's a new policy that says you must share your data, people will share their data, mostly, with some encouragement. So I think that's really one piece, is to think about who are the stakeholders. And so the stakeholders could be funders. They could be the institutions. So, for example, I or somebody else could come to every university and say to the university, this is what I think is important, and try to give some data that shows that and see if people at the university agree and if they want to do something about it. We've tried to work with publishers because a large amount of scholarship is published in journals, and so if the publishers say to the journal, say to the authors, you should be submitting the software you use, you should be citing the software you use, then that kind of raises the visibility of that as well. So I think it's a combination of these things. Also, I've done some work in going to disciplinary meetings. So I've gone to some of the physics meetings, particularly in high energy physics, and worked with them so that their conference proceedings highlight software, and also I've given like a plenary talk about why software is important and why people should think about it. So I think there's lots of things like that, and the challenge is just that no one person can do all of these things because they don't have enough time. So we need to get more people together to do these things.
Yeah, so we are facing this challenge to convince people the importance of software, and they use software day by day, and it's complicated. Do you have a question from the local audience? We have an extra mic here.
Before you mentioned the importance of citing software in publications, and I have two questions about that. The first one is to make it easy to cite. So, for example, as part of my research, I do produce a lot of software that it is open source, but normally what I do is to simply put in a repository, a GitLab, GitHub, and assign an open source license to it. And then when I publish a paper, I simply say the source code is available at, and I put the URL. So what do you mean? What is making it easy to cite? Well, so do you think this is okay, or it's important to go one step further and do other things?
So I would say going one step further is important. What you're doing is good, but the indexing systems, like again, Web of Science, Scopus, things like that, don't have any knowledge when you put some text into the paper. And so there's no way of saying, I don't know, 25 papers this year have put this text into the paper. Whereas if you make a reference to the software, you say, here's the authors, here's the title, here's the year, here's the URL or the DOI if you want as well, then that will automatically get tracked. And then you can say, here are the 25 papers that used my software and published papers in this year. And if you do that, then that leads, if you're going to, let's say you're going to ask for funding to make your software better, you can say, here's where my software is being used. These projects are dependent on my software. Because you can't, without the indexing part, you can't do this otherwise. And so I think there's two different things you can do. One is that you can deposit your software into a repository. Zenodo, that's in Europe, is the kind of the classic one that gets used, but it can be an institutional repository, it can be Figshare, a commercial repository. There's lots of choices. But putting it somewhere that accepts it, takes metadata, like author's name, access points, things like that, and creates some kind of identifier that's usually a DOI, but can be something else. Like in biology, it maybe would be an RRID. In math, it might be an SW math ID. In astronomy, it could be an ASCL ID. So there's a bunch of different identifiers, but to have some identifier that can be indexed and then that can be used to understand how the software is being used is important. So I think that's one piece. The second piece is that if you are putting your software onto GitHub, there is a way that you can create a small file in your repository that has the metadata information, again, the authors, the title, the license, a few other things. And if you create this metadata file, which I would say is kind of a little bit magic, it's called citation.cff. If you create this file in your repository, when you look at the web page on GitHub, a little button will now appear. And that little button says how to cite the software. And it actually then will link to the information that you put into that metadata file. So then anybody that's getting the software and using it has a very easy way of being able to tell how to cite it. You can do the same thing in your README file so that becomes visible. You can do the same thing if you're writing a paper about the software. You can say, right, if you're going to use the software, please cite it and give the citation there as well. So I think there's a bunch of different ways that you can do this. The more of them you do, the more likely it is people will use one of them. So.
And you're involved also with the Journal of Open Source Software, right? And that's probably also a good way to register the software is to have a paper there, right?
Yeah, so the Journal of Open Source Software, sorry, it's a little bit confusing because I'm kind of saying two things at once, and so I kind of have to justify why I'm saying two things that don't quite agree with each other. So one of them is that if we say where we are today, today we have papers and they have references, and most of those references are to other papers. Where we would like to go in the future is that some of those references are to software directly. But some people don't like this idea and they aren't ready for this idea yet. So the Journal of Open Source Software is kind of a middle point. It's saying we'd like people to cite software, but people want to cite papers, so let's give them a easy paper that can stand in for the software. And so that's what the Journal of Open Source Software is on one hand. From that point of view, it's, as I was saying this morning, it's intended to be as easy as possible to create a paper, to have it reviewed, and to have it published. And so if you do that, then that can be basically, again, the placeholder, the stand-in for the software that you can cite. And every journal will be happy to include a reference of that kind because it's a paper, they know what it is, they're used to it, it's fine. Sometimes if you try to cite software, some journal may be unhappy. Some editor might look at it and say,
I don't know what this is. The identifier is not the right type. It's something else. So while we're trying to get to that point, the Journal of Open Source Software fits that. But I'll say on the other hand, and I kind of hinted at this but didn't talk about it earlier, the other thing the Journal of Open Source Software does is it creates a community around practices for software. So the review process is driven by a checklist. There's 18 items on that checklist. The 2 or more reviewers have to go through the checklist and check off all of those items. And so we're basically saying these 18 items are the minimum that you need to have decent software. Those items have changed over time. So one of the items is testing, for example. What we said 8 years ago for testing is weaker than what we say today. So we think that the software community has gotten better over time. And because of that, we can increase the standards a little bit to try to make software better as well, to make the minimum better. We also have, I think I said we've published about 2,500 papers. We've had about 4,000 reviewers. So this is, I don't know, 6,000 or 7,000 people that have gotten used to this style, to thinking about software is important, this is what it should be, this is how we review it, this is how we evaluate it. So we're trying to use that also as a community to make the software better and to make the awareness of software better.
Okay, then thank you. That was very helpful. The second question is related to that. You said we should demand software to be cited in papers. And then if I have a paper in Journal of Open Source Software, that's easy to cite it because it's just a bibliographic reference. If I simply have a GitHub repository with that citation file there, what do you mean, how that would be cited? It's cited in the text, or you mean it should go in the bibliography and contain what?
Yeah, so cited as a reference. Yeah, I guess, so I noticed that there's a information science or library building kind of in here as well. So I'm not actually, I'm not going to use these words extremely accurately, but I guess I would say that to me, citation and reference are kind of two things that are almost the same. Sometimes people say the citation is the thing that's in the paper and the reference is the thing at the list at the end. And sometimes people use it the other way around, that the reference goes to the citation. So one of them is more correct from an information science point of view, and the other one is more correct in terms of what people do in the sciences. So it's a little bit confusing, but I think of these two things as being the pair. And just mentioning something in the text without pointing to something at the end, to me, is not a citation or a reference. It's just text. And unless we're going to have machine learning going through all of the text and trying to capture ideas and things, which maybe will happen one day, having something just in the text doesn't actually lead to anything useful other than for the people that directly read that paper. Nothing gets outside of the paper, whereas if you have the citation and the reference, or the reference and the citation, whichever way you want to say it, that information goes outside of the paper and goes into the indexing systems.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I have another question. Do you know we have to have some good examples to follow? Can you cite some projects, research projects that had good software and were a kind of successful synergy between software and research and can be used as an example for us?
Yeah, so I think I would say one of the, it's not exactly in terms of papers directly, but one thing that's been very useful is some of the projects that have made quite a bit of news coverage. So the black hole picture that was taken maybe 2 years ago now, I don't remember exactly, but this collection of instruments in 7 places in the world that brought a lot of data together, and we were able to create an image of a black hole based on the data from those images. In their papers, they've cited the software that they've used, some of which has been developed for those projects. Some of the people that developed that have been in the news as developers of that software, as well as researchers who were involved in finding the discovery. And at least in some cases, this has led to professor jobs for them. And again, it's not based on being part of a 500-member team. It's based on being the person that wrote the software that enabled that 500-member team to get the result. So I think that's one of them. Another is the maybe 4 or 5 years ago, there was the discovery of a gravitational wave that was correlated with an image that was observed in the visible spectra and I think ultraviolet as well, but I'm not 100% sure if it was what the other spectra was. But it was the first time that there was a correlation of a gravitational wave burst with something that you could see through some other electromagnetic means. And again, they did something very similar. They cited all the software they used in their papers, and they also then wrote about which software was particularly important that they couldn't have worked without.
Thank you. More questions?
A minha pergunta, vou fazer em português. A questão de a engenharia de software sempre está dizendo que pode contribuir para o software de pesquisa. A minha pergunta é, principalmente na educação, na ciência da computação, o quanto que o software de pesquisa também pode ensinar, contribuir para a educação de engenharia de software. Os nossos alunos estão muito mais envolvidos hoje em dia, preocupados em criar uma startup. Mas a gente sabe que os grandes problemas do mundo são problemas que o software de pesquisa está precisando de bons talentos.
Your Spanish is as good as I think? No, okay. So the question is, how can research software engineering collaborate to software engineering or even software engineer education?
Right. So that's okay. So this is a very, very good question. It's very timely as well. In 3 weeks ago, we had a seminar in Germany at the Dagstuhl Seminar Center. And the purpose of this seminar was to bring together research software engineers with software engineers who study research. So exactly this topic, we're just starting to do some work in this area. In the seminar, we had basically 5 days of discussions. No talk that was more than 3 minutes long, so almost entirely discussion and work. And we are trying to now form a community that is at the intersection of these 2 points. We are going to be producing, hopefully, somewhere between 5 and 9 papers of some kind of output. One is going to be a series of videos because somebody wanted to do videos, but the others are going to be papers of some kind. Some of them are going to be 10 simple rules papers that happens in PLOS computational biology. They published this series called 10 simple rules. So we want a few things like that. Some of them are probably going to be, well, hopefully are going to be in the Journal of Computing and Science and Engineering, or SCIENCE. And in addition to these kind of outputs that are going to define, hopefully, what we think is the right problem and the interaction between these 2 groups and some of the aspects of that, we also are interested in trying to create events where people can come together more than just the 35 people that were at this one meeting. So there's been a series of workshops called Software Engineering for Science, or SE for Science. These have happened in the research, kind of in the computational field. They've happened at ICSE and at some of the other software engineering conferences as well. We want to do something like that, but more focused on research software engineering and software engineering. And so I'm hopeful that there will be some workshops that will start appearing at like ICSE or ASE or some of the software engineering conferences specifically to do this. I think the other part of this that hopefully will happen is that some of the people who are the software engineering professors who were at this meeting, I think, are more aware now of research software as something that they can study and something that they can help. And so I hope that this actually leads to examples that they talk about more within the software engineering community. So I think the answer is, this is something that hasn't happened very well in the past. We're aware of it as a problem. We're trying to work on it now. We don't have direct answers yet, but we're thinking about it a lot. And if you're interested, I can try to connect you into the groups that are doing this if you want to get involved in it. Is that okay, or do we need to translate it?
No, should I translate it to Portuguese again? I don't think so. It's kind of. I have another question. In our field, I would say computer science, reproducibility, it's a must. And with reproducibility, we have all the tools to have more professional development because we need to be reproducible, so we need to provide more tools, more artifacts. And are you aware about other fields? What are they doing about reproducibility? Is it helping or?
Yeah, so I have to say, I think I know the answer, but I'm not completely sure, and I'm not 100% serious, but did you say reproducibility is a must or reproducibility is a mess?
It's a must.
Okay, because I think it's actually both. So I would say, honestly, in computer science, in terms of people that are working with computer science artifacts, they're definitely not leading the field of reproducibility. If I was going to say, it's a little bit hard to say because there's a lot of different kinds of work, and the reproducibility practices are quite different in different kinds of work. So in people that are doing basically data science in some sense, there's kind of one set of reproducibility practices. And people that are studying humans, right, there's a different set of things that need to happen in patient studies or things like that. Right, so there's the idea, for example, of pre-registration of studies, which I don't know if you, okay, so, but maybe I'll just say briefly the idea that before you do the study, you register publicly what you're going to look for. And so then you look for it and you can't decide in the middle, I looked for this, but I didn't get a significant result, but I noticed something else. And so maybe this is a significant result. And so I should publish this instead, which leads to kind of, I don't know, effectively a publication record that isn't fair to what's actually happened. So that's one piece. The other piece is then for things that are purely computational science, some computer science, but even computer science is hard to say because work in human-computer interaction falls into a very different category than, let's say, somebody that's working on compiler design. So what reproducibility means for computer science is one thing either. But the idea, I think, in general, of having reproducibility badges, which is done by both ACM and IEEE Computer Society, is a reasonable one, and it seems workable in some sense, except that no matter what kind of reproducibility you think about, there always are things that don't work. So if I'm working in computer science and I used in a very, very large high-performance computing system to do some work over 3 months, it's very hard for me to say, how could somebody reproduce that? Because I don't know who's going to give them 3 months of time to do something that somebody else has already done. So I think one of the ways that I think about reproducibility is trust. That reproducibility is increasing trust in the result. And a question then that comes up is, where do you start? Right? And so if you're thinking again of human subjects research, you can think of reproducibility as you could ask a different set of people the same questions and see what happens, or do the same study with different people. You could think of that you're starting with the answer, the data that you got back from the people, and you want to reproduce everything from that point onward. So I think the question of where exactly in that chain you start to do the reproducibility is pretty important. I guess the other thing is that there's work that is published that's based on data that is not open, or software that's not open for a variety of reasons. Sometimes you're using commercial software that you just can't make open. Sometimes you're using data that has some kind of privacy restriction or some kind of commercial restriction. And so in those cases, the final work is almost certainly going to be impossible to reproduce. But then the question is there something else that could be reproduced that gives you more confidence and more trust in that result? And the answer is probably yes, but we don't do that very often.
More questions, comments?
Thank you for the presentation in the morning. in the morning you have showed some reasons for not sharing. People, I loved that representation. What do you think it's the main concern in your point of view, and how we should act to then considering open science in general? For example, I'm not a software engineer, or I don't work with that, but I notice the same problems with data, for example, and other things. So I think it's some comments can be useful for anyone, despite of the area, considering open science.
Yeah, I think, sorry, I don't know how well this translates, but we have the term about the carrot and the stick. Right, the carrot is the thing that's the incentive, and then the stick is the punishment or the enforcement. And so we often, I think, can think of both of these things as being useful. And for sharing data, at least, it seems to, in the US, it seems to be publisher mandates and funder mandates are the two big things that encourage people to do this. It's not, they don't necessarily do it very well, though. They do the minimum that's needed. And if the reviewers don't care, they get away with doing the minimum that's needed. In NSF projects and projects that are funded by the US NSF, people are required to provide a data management plan as part of their proposal. The data management plan is reviewed by the peer reviewers when the proposal is awarded or not, but that's the end. That's the last time that anybody looks at it. Right? So then they go on for 3 years or 5 years and do the project, and they've said something that they're going to do in the data management plan, but it's not public, and nobody is likely to look at it again, with some exceptions. There are some parts of NSF where the program officers will look at it and they will not sign off on the project at the end until the people have met that plan. But that's unusual, and it takes a lot of work from the program officers, who usually don't have enough time to do all of the work they need to do already. So there's a lot of times, so you can think about kind of these different aspects, that first people need to say what they're going to do in a good way, and then they actually need to do it. And the different sticks maybe have more or less weight, depending on where those things happen in the process. Now, on the other side, on the side of the carrot or the incentives, I think the thing that's interesting to me is that there's faculty members who I know who basically require people in their group to do these things. And those people then, when they move on and they become faculty members themselves, also require their students to do this. And so to some extent, as we change some people and we change the way that they train students, then that has an effect that carries on. And as professional societies change what they're doing, whether those are enforced by journals or by conferences or just by standards, those also have an effect. And so I think this is one of those cases where, I don't know, I guess this doesn't necessarily sound good, but we have people that think a certain way, and eventually those people will go away. And then we have more people that come in that are ideally are thinking in a different way, and that idea then takes over. So I think that over time we are moving in the direction where things will become more open, but it's a generational change. It's not an immediate change. And to make things happen faster is where mandates come in.
Thank you.
I have a comment on that. In fact, FAPESP now demands a data management plan in each project, and in large projects it's a yearly review. And one of the first questions in the questionnaire is the project following the data management plan? So the reviewer must every year answer that. So I think the FAPESP is doing the good thing, but in a few areas, that's not the culture of the area. So the review, it's not in the culture of the reviewer, it's not in the culture of the scientist, so not necessarily he will actually mandate that, but I think in the long run, at least we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, so even I'll say that even with NSF, it's very similar that. So I worked for NSF for 4 years, and I ran a number of peer review panels when I was there, and so I have some experience with how this works. But mostly, I would say the reviewers. We would ask the reviewers, "How was the data management plan?" And the answer we usually got was fine. Usually, it wasn't clear that they'd actually read it or that they cared about it. Sometimes, and this was rare, but there were a few instances where a proposal that was very good scientifically ended up being rejected because the reviewer would say they're doing all of this great work, but they're not actually going to produce anything that anybody else can use other than a paper. Why aren't they sharing the data? Why don't they say they're going to make this a part of the project? And so a couple of times that was enough to get a project rejected. And that was the feedback that went to the proposer. And so hopefully the next time they actually write something that's better. But it was rare. And the other, again, just going back to the review part for NSF projects, for small and medium projects, there is no review. There's just an annual report that the program officer reads and has to sign off and say it's okay. And so then it's a question of, does the program officer have time? Can they go back to the proposal and look at the data management plan? For big projects, there is a review, usually once a year, maybe it's halfway through the project and towards the end. Those, in theory, could look at the data management plan, but the data management plan is part of the proposal. And as part of the proposal, it's actually private and not shared. And so it's kind of up to the program officer to say, here are some things that they said that you should be reviewing. It's not something that happens by default.
Now kind of not so related to software question, and talking about open science. To have open science, we have to have a way to show the results to a broader audience, not only researchers, not only the peers. And do you have any hint on how to do it in a good way or some good examples on it?
I'm not sure that I have a very good answer overall. I think it depends an awful lot on the field. So I think there's different fields with different characteristics. So in some fields, again, astronomy as an example, there's a lot of general interest in astronomy, right? Because people see stars, they're interested in galaxies and what happened a long time ago, or things are going in the future. So there's kind of let's say a hobbyist community, people that are not professional astronomers but are quite interested. And they often follow either some of the literature directly or they follow some of the news. And in some cases, there are projects where they can get involved in the project. Galaxy Zoo is one of these examples where maybe 10 or 15 years ago, I don't remember exactly, a lot of images were taken as part of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, I think, and maybe other sky surveys as well. Astronomers wanted to look at these images and classify the different kinds of galaxies that were in these images. And at this time, it wasn't clear that machine learning would really be able to do this, and they didn't have trained data that they could use. And so they put all of these galaxies onto a website and basically asked people in the public that were interested to come in and help them classify these galaxies, or these other objects at least. And they turned it into something that could be a game in some ways, so people would get credit for the number of things they did correctly. They were concerned about accuracy, so they would have each thing be identified by different people distinctly and make sure that they got the same answers before they would trust something. So it was a way that people that were interested in the area could feel like they were contributing to science, even without having a master's or a PhD. And as far as I know, there were 2 objects that people saw that didn't fit anything that anybody knew. And so these were effectively new discoveries in astronomy by people in the public. And so I think that's one of the things is to, if you have people that are interested, to try to think of a way that they can participate and feel like they're really contributing. So that's one thing that worked. I'll say that one thing that I don't remember where the example came from, but one thing that didn't work that was more recent. Sorry, there's another example. There's a bunch of examples of where the Galaxy Zoo technology was used. Another one was used in images of penguins, and people counting the penguins and classifying the penguins and saying, were they sleeping, were they standing, do they have eggs? So there's a lot of interesting kind of things like this. There's one that didn't work, and I don't remember the details of it, but it was basically that the people that were being asked to do the work that they were doing was not actually going to be used for science directly, but it was going to be used to train a machine learning model. And they were much less happy with that because they didn't feel like they were actually contributing to science. They felt like they were educating a computer. And so that was not so exciting. So I think there's this question about how people get involved is a lot dependent on their motivation and what they can do. I'd say the other thing that shows up a lot these days is in medicine, right, where people that have something that might be a disease or a condition or something else, if they feel like their doctor isn't recognizing it in the way that they're describing it, if they feel like it's something that's maybe where other people have the same thing, maybe it's something rare that doesn't get studied very well. It seems like there's a few different areas where there's people that kind of educate themselves to read enough of the medical literature that they can try to make suggestions as to what could be happening or form collectives to try to encourage new trials or new experiments. And so it seems like that happens quite a bit as well. So I guess part of the question then is how is the scientific information being communicated to people in the public who might be interested in it for different ways, for different purposes? And there's, again, different answers to this. One is that there's an area of trying to make abstracts as readable as possible by the general public, to kind of take the jargon away and be very clear and very simple about what's happening. There also is work in AI to actually try to take the abstracts and have a machine learning model or a generative AI model do the same thing to make them more understandable for somebody that hasn't been in the field for a long time. So I guess to me it seems like a lot of what happens is either through people that are interested in literature and reading it in some way and being able to read it in some way, or people that are interested in some other products like data and being able to use that. If we do go back to software, even though you didn't want to ask about software, software is a place where I think there is a lot of overlap, because a lot of if we tried to define research software, it's very context dependent. So an example of this is a compiler. So if if you're a biologist and you're building some software using a compiler, the compiler isn't research software for you. It's just a tool you're using in the same way that Microsoft Word might be a tool that you're using to write your paper or something else. But if you're a computer scientist and you're working on research and compilers, then the compiler is research software for you. And so the question about what is research software and what isn't depends very much on the context. And because of that, there's a significant amount of software that may or may not be research software, but has contributions from industry and from other people. People that maybe are just working in their spare time because they want to work on it because they're interested in the software itself, or possibly because they're interested in how it could be used in research. So there is kind of this overlap as well that happens with software.
Thank you. Any more questions, comments? So I'd like to, oh, sorry. Oh, no. So I'd like to thank you again for your time here to trying to help us on open science with software. And thank you again.
Thank you as well.